Hi, everyone. It's Mrs. Heyer, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about clay and how to work with clay here at Sinaloa and all the things you're not supposed to do with clay. Unfortunately, there's a lot of that when you are first learning clay with us here at Sinaloa. A lot of things that you can't really do. And the reason is our clay is a clay that goes in a kiln, K-I-L-N, kiln. And a kiln is just a big, huge oven that fires clay or cooks clay, let's say, up to about 3,000 degrees. Now, our clay is a low fire clay, so it fires to about 1,900 degrees, and it does that process for a long time, about 18 hours. So what it's doing, what the kiln is doing, is it's pulling all the moisture out of this clay here and completely baking it. Believe it or not, that is a white clay. And of course, you don't think it's white because it looks completely gray to you, but that's because it has lots and lots of water in it. And so the kiln will be removing that and hardening the clay. So since we're working with temperatures of 1,900 degrees, you can imagine that scientifically there's some things that happen. For instance, this is not like Play-Doh. If we gave you something like this with Play-Doh, the first thing you're going to want to do is pick it up and squish it around. Well, when you're picking it up and you're squishing it around, what you're doing is you're actually embedding a whole lot of air in it. Okay, and you're closing things up. And you might even be getting big, huge little air spaces inside. Well, if you trap those air spaces, that means you close them up, then what happens to the air when it heats up to 1,900 degrees? So you might remember that air expands when it's hot. So it suddenly expands so fast that it busts the clay, or actually it can be a small explosion. And so your piece would be wrecked because it's broken now. But two other things can happen that are worse than that. They can bust somebody else's art piece that's sitting in the kiln next to it, or the break can also break the filaments in the kiln. And if we break filaments in a kiln, we have no clay program here. So we don't want to do that. So once again, the most important thing, and it's very hard to remember, is when we give you clay, you cannot pick it up and do a lot of manipulation the way you would do with Play-Doh, okay? Now, one other thing that you might accidentally do that you absolutely can't do, you might kind of streak in things like this and go, oops, I'm just going to cover that up. Well, what I've done is I've put a little roof over those little deep grooves that I had. And again, I may have trapped some of the air in there. So we have to be careful about that. If that happens, what you want to do is also apply pressure. Imagine that you're closing up those holes. I have had kids actually, probably without realizing it, created some kind of large hole like that in the clay, and then they may have actually covered it. So now I have a really big hole, and that is absolutely probably going to explode. A student did do that, and it was funny because after it exploded, I could see that hole in it, and I could see what they had done. And indeed, they did break 3 other pieces of art that was in the kiln. So don't do that. I do want you to know that everything I'm doing here today on this clay, I probably will not fire because I've done a lot of, strange things to it. But again, if there is a hole, applying pressure and making sure that that hole doesn't exist is really important. Okay, for a lot of the projects that we do, we're going to be using a slab. And that means that we're going to cut clay for you that's in this slab right here. Now, clay, one other thing about clay going into the kiln is it can't be more than about 1 inch thick. And that's because if it's really thick somewhere, it's just a big ball of clay or a real thick thing of clay, the inside of the clay won't fully dry in the air, because clay, we let the clay dry for a week before we put it in the kiln. And when I say dry, I mean it, obviously the kiln's going to dry it a lot more, but we need it dry to go into the kiln. And anyway, this section right here does not dry. And so the moisture tries to escape too fast. And what happens is your clay breaks again. So always be thinking that when you create something in clay, have you created a spot that's more than an inch thick? If you have, it's not really a big deal. What you're going to do is from the back of that section, you'll just put a tunnel, like a hole, in the back of that section. And a hole is okay as long as you haven't sealed the hole. So popping a hole up into that clay that's too thick can let air get up into the center. So that's kind of something your teacher will also be watching for. Okay, so going back to this is what we call a slab of clay. It's on a piece of canvas because otherwise it's going to stick to your desk. So you always want to work on the canvas. You have what we call guides right here, meaning that when we work with slabs, this is a really good thickness to have. And so we're going to be rolling this clay to this thickness. So that's what the guides are for. Another important tool is your cutting tool. So this is for you to go ahead and make cuts in it or shape it. I'll show you in a project how you want to hold that straight up when you do cutting. This is your joining tool. If you guys have done clay with other teachers in elementary school, they may have helped you join one piece of clay to another piece of clay using what they call slip, which is a wet, moist, like a wet thing of clay. I find that this is actually a better deal using this, and I'll show you in just a sec what that is. What's really, really, really important is that if you're ever going to mark clay, like you want to dig in and make a mark in it, do not do it with your cutter. That tool is only to cut things away. This tool is for poking little holes and doing a connecting clay. If you have a dull pencil, that's going to be your best bet for making marks in the clay. And the reason is it's not going to be too deep. You never want to go too deep. Small marks really show in clay. So using a dull pencil is best. So don't try to make marks in it with this sharp tool. It doesn't turn out well. Okay, so I'm going to make sure that those holes are buried. Okay, so here's how you roll a slab. You're going to put the guides next to the clay, but you do not want to put the guides completely next to the clay. Now, you probably can't see this, but this clay is thicker than the guides. And so we're trying to bring the clay all the way down to this thickness. Well, if we put the guides right next to it, we're going to roll the clay right on top of the guides. So you always want the guides off to the side. Okay? Make sure it's about, half of an inch or an inch off to the side of the clay at all times. Okay, then you're going to be rolling with a rolling pin. For sixth graders, this can be a little bit hard because it kind of takes a lot of oomph. And so in a way, the bigger the body, the more oomph you can put into the rolling. But one thing that can be helpful for you guys if you're a little bit small is to stand up. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that right now, and you can watch the clay. I'm standing up, and when I put pressure down like this, it's applying a lot more oomph than just sitting down and doing this. And by the way, just doing this does nothing. It's actually putting pressure on this. So you put your palms on there, start in the middle, you rock it back and forth, and notice that this clay is getting longer. Now, pay attention to what project that you're doing, because getting longer is great for some projects, but maybe you also want to get wider. So let's say I've gotten longer, but I also want to get wider. I'm going to pick that clay right back up off of the canvas, keeping the guides only, away from the clay.